Phil Hargreaves, and it's good to have you there on Facebook Live. And then we have some in-person people, and thanks for coming out. This is actually best in person. So I'm the children's director here. I focus on K through 5th and supervise the nursery and preschool person that's here. I was, when I was a young dad with some young kids, 1989, in Santa Cruz, California, there was an earthquake. A pretty good sized one. I was in San Francisco at the time. My kids and my wife were in Santa Cruz, closer to where the epicenter of that earthquake was. And it was a time I look back where our family went through trauma. And I look back and I go, how did we do that as parents, is kind of to walk through with our kids. Our middle daughter actually stopped talking for about, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks, didn't say a word. There was just a lot of fear in her. And so I look back and I guess I wish I had kind of this Lauren person in my life to help me figure out, how do I help my kids through this? It wasn't a pandemic, it was just trauma that they had in their life. So Lauren Tritine Spencer grew up here in Gig Harbor, and she grew up in this church as well, was baptized here, and she heard one of Pastor Mark's sermons one Sunday and just thought, I need to use my gifts to help people in this. And so she did go on to get her master's and is a marriage family counselor, specializing in anxiety, which is what we're all facing a little bit, especially with children. So, when she was moved by Pastor Mark, she just emailed, I guess, Pastor Mark and said, how can we do this? And and she also sees parents and some kids too, in helping them to deal with it. And she just wanted to offer it in a larger scale, this helping us through this process and dealing with this trauma in our lives. One thing for you that are on Facebook Live, if you have a question at any point in time, I'm going to sit over here kind of like a DJ or something, and I'm going to kind of feed your questions to Lauren. For you just ask the questions. You know where your bathrooms are too, right? Yeah, so I don't need to tell you that. So here we go. Welcome. Give a good welcome for Lauren here.
Yay! Hi guys. So obviously I'm Lauren. So as Paul said, I am here to talk about parenting in a pandemic, what it is like, why it's so hard in the first place, and then what to do about that. So at any point, feel free to pause me, raise your hand. Any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. And then at the end of the time, we'll also have plenty of question and answer time. So if you're in person, you kind of get first dibs on questions. So let's first let you know who you're talking to. So as Paul said, I am born and raised in Gig Harbor. I did my undergrad program at Whitworth, so I went to Spokane for 4 years, but other than that, I've been born and raised in my first love of Western Washington. I am working at Cornerstone OCD and Anxiety Group. I'm all online because I am a military spouse moving to Korea soon, actually. And I specialize in anxiety and marriage counseling. And I also have a lot of work working with sweet, sweet kids. So let's move on. We're going to cover some connection time if you're here in person and give you guys a chance to talk to each other about how hard this has been. I know schools are opening up a bit, but a lot of parents have opted to stay at home with their kids or try and work and have their kids homeschool and all of that stuff. So we're going to give you some time to vent and talk about what's been the hardest. And then we're going to talk about why it's been so hard. And just the trauma aspect of what it is like to live in a pandemic. And then we're going to talk about what to do about that. So we're going to go over coping skills, both that you can teach your kids and that you guys can do as well, because how are you going to pour into kids when your own cup is empty? And then we're going to cover warning signs when you want to get some extra help. That might be a counselor, a doctor, or even 911, depending on what we're talking about. And then any now what questions, how do you implement these, that types of thing. Okay, so ever since March, I think the vast majority of my sessions with clients have been talking about at least one of these. And so we're going to talk about it a little bit here, and then after that I'll give you guys some time to talk at least 6 feet away from each other about what's been hard. So financial stress, first and foremost, has been the top predictor of stress response during COVID. I mean, if you think about it, especially as parents, you're not only providing for each other or just yourself, you're also providing for your kids. And so when finances are in question, which they were hugely at the beginning of COVID and still are, that puts a lot of pressure on you guys to provide. And when there's stress around that, creates a stress response, and then it's just like a lot of anxiety going on. And then the next two, no alone time and also isolation. I know it sounds weird, but it's accurate. So you guys as parents have your kids around 24/7, right? And then put quarantine on top of that, or at least the relative lockdown. You're even more around your kids all the time. So there's really no space for you guys to do the self-care practices that you would normally do. And so that puts a lot of stress on you. On the flip side of that, we've basically been told to isolate, right? That's what our governors told us since March. And while it is important, absolutely, for health reasons, we're not made to be alone. We thrive with people, we're relational, and a lot of our self-care and mental health, emotional health comes from being around other people and our support systems. So when COVID hits and we're all supposed to isolate as much as possible, those support systems get cut off, and then it's like, well, who can I talk to? If you have a spouse, it's a similar situation, right? They're the only person you're seeing in person every day, and you're seeing a lot of them, and sometimes we get on each other's nerves and stuff like that. If you don't have a spouse, again, you're even more isolated. So, moral of the story, isolation is really hard. And then burnout. I think that's a big one for everybody right now, is we thought this was going to last for 2 weeks, a month tops, right? Remember back in March? It was like, okay, we're going to close down, we'll be fine, and then we'll open up and everything will be normal again. And here we are about 8 months later, and we're still wearing masks, we're still trying to isolate as much as we can, and we're tired of it, we're sick of it. We want to get back to normal, and now there's that kind of a question of if we ever will. And that in and of itself creates a burnout effect. Then there's the mom and dad or caregiver guilt. I talk about this all the time with clients because as a therapist, I'm constantly like, well, what are you doing to take care of yourselves? And they're like, well, nothing, I don't have time. It's all about my kids. And that goes back to that empty cup thing, right? How are you going to pour into them if you're empty? But then you feel guilty when you do take time for yourself, or you do spend some time just by yourself, and then you feel guilty about that. And I'm always like, no, don't feel guilty. So hopefully by the end of this, you won't feel as guilty. And then, like I mentioned, there's also the educating and the working aspect thing. So kids are at home, or at least one of your kids is at home, or if they're away, you're probably working from home. So if you have multiple kids who are supposed to be doing online school, you're also working from home. How do you do that, right? How do you manage when Tommy has to be on at 8, you have a work call at 8:30, and Kimberly's school starts at 9, right? Like, how are you managing that? It's really, really difficult. So that's just going to bring a lot of stress into your life in general. And then, of course, if you're watching this or if you're attending this, you're concerned about your kiddo's mental health, their mental wellness, emotional wellness, all of those things. And it's hard. It's hard to be a parent of kids right now because as much as we understand what's going on because we have developed brains, all they know is that they weren't allowed to go to school for a while. And so you guys are obviously really pouring into them as much as you can, but it is stressful to be concerned about your kids' wellness. And then, of course, health anxiety. I think this pandemic basically made all of us a little bit more aware of what it's like to have a diagnosis of health anxiety because we all have a touch of it now, right? We cough once and we're like, oh my gosh, this is it, I've got COVID. And while that's an understandable response, it creates kind of this underlying, consistent, constant sense of health anxiety, whether or not it's what we're like conscious of all the time, it's an underlying thought. So all of these things are huge, right? You put all of these together in one pandemic, and now all of a sudden we're balls of stress, and then we're mad at ourselves for being balls of stress. So that is what I want to give a little bit more time to you guys to do, is to turn to, let's see, you guys maybe, and you guys, welcome, hi, and talk about which one of these has been the hardest for you, or multiple, which ones of these have been hardest, and I'll come around a little bit to each of you guys to hear your perspectives. I know it's hard when we're 6 feet away, but at least we're in person. So I'll give you probably like 5 minutes to just kind of have that vent session of which of these stand out to you. Okay, we're gonna bring it back, so wrap it up, face me again if you can. Is there anything on Facebook, anybody talking about things on there?
Well, they just, one person said it's the teens' anxiety that they feel the most right now.
Yeah, and that's another thing I didn't put up here, but you feel what your kids are feeling, right? So if your kid's having a hard time emotionally, like your teen, you're going to connect to that. And it's hard as a parent to disconnect when we need to disconnect or not be fully emotionally influenced by that type of thing. So it is really hard when our kids are struggling. So again, hopefully we'll get you some tools to help with that. Okay, so, yep, there you go. I just asked that question. So let's talk about why COVID has been so hard. I think we did a really good job of this at the beginning when this all started, of being like, yeah, this sucks, this is terrible. And now we've kind of gone quiet on that because this is our norm. It's been about 8 months. It's like, this is the new normal. Fine, like we're all fine, right? We're not all fine. So what they're finding is depression rates have increased 3-fold. That blew my mind. Depression is already relatively rampant, and it's increased 3-fold since COVID, so it's directly related. Stress continues to be on the rise, which also surprised me because, again, it's like, oh, things are fine now. We're used to this. But I think part of that is the fact that we don't have the same light at the end of the tunnel that we thought we did in the beginning. Again, this was going to be a month tops. Definitely wasn't going to be part of our summer, and now we're going into winter when, if you live here in the Pacific Northwest, is already doom and gloom as is. So stress rates are continuing to rise. 63% of young adults are having symptoms of anxiety and depression, again, related to COVID. So that's the majority on top of those who already had pre-existing conditions. And then, same statistic is 63% of parents are reporting a loss of emotional support, which goes back to that isolation piece. And it makes sense. Again, I think of like my neighbor who her mom and dad used to fly out to visit them all the time and help with the kids, and it was just a great time to connect. And now they can't do that. They haven't seen them since COVID started. So you're kind of stuck feeling that way, at least. And then on top of that, imagine being a new mom, a pregnant mother, or just bringing new life into this world. I can only imagine that level of stress. And so now they're finding, 29% and now it is 72% of new moms are experiencing significant anxiety. Point being, we're not used to COVID. So this is my kind of motto when I'm talking to clients is living through a pandemic is traumatic. We need to start treating it as such, which is part of why you guys are here. Now let me tell you why. So a little overview of what trauma actually is, how it's defined. On the right, you'll see 4 different categories. So either there's direct exposure, witnessing in person, you saw it happen. Indirect exposure, as in like you learned about it, a close personal friend or a family member, you learned about that. Or the indirect exposure, such as that's like our healthcare workers, our doctors, our paramedics, our mental health professionals. And then what you're exposed to is death, threatened death, serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. So if you think about that, applying that to COVID, since so many people, even though it is technically a small percentage are passing away from this, there is a sense of this is actual or threatened death, or at least serious illness. And you're either directly experiencing it, you got COVID, it was a really serious case, or you're witnessing it, your grandma got COVID. Indirect is where you're learning, it's kind of that friend of a friend like you saw on Facebook, like, oh my gosh, my friend's mom has COVID, right? So it's all connected. Or of course, our amazing doctors and nurses who have been working on the front line so much, they're experiencing all of that trauma. Currently, the DSM, which is our diagnostic manual, doesn't give credit to things like a pandemic influence on the trauma definition, but why would they? Because we haven't had one since, the early 1900s. So there's a lot of speculation that this will get added. So specific to why COVID-19 is traumatic and different, I know a lot of people kind of compare this to, when the Spanish flu came about. So some differences here is it's global. I don't think there's a part of the world that hasn't been touched unless you're in the North Pole or Iceland or something like that, right? Everywhere is experiencing this. On top of that, we are all aware of that. So if you think about the Spanish flu back in the day, you'd have to write a letter like, oh, guess who has the Spanish flu, poor auntie, that type of thing. But if you didn't get that letter, you wouldn't know. I mean, people in America probably had no idea how bad it was in Europe and that type of thing. We have access to those statistics 24/7. I remember when this first hit, I stopped listening to the radio entirely and encouraged my clients to at least take notice of what it was doing when they were looking at the news, because it skyrockets our anxiety. We're not only witnessing the impacts of Little Pierce County, but King County, our state, our country, and the entire world. So we are able to access and witness other people's trauma 24/7. And then on top of that, we have this sense of anticipatory anxiety. And by that, I mean it's there's no light at the end of the tunnel type thing, right? What if this lasts until 2025? What if I get COVID? What if a loved one gets COVID? What if I pass on COVID? There's a lot of just anticipatory anxiety and trying to deal with uncertainty. And that creates a stress response. So when somebody is in that stress response due to trauma or just a significant life event, these are things that happen. So, like I said, for kind of the beginning with the challenges of COVID, we've got threats to life, literal physical threats. We've also got threats to finances. We're all living in uncertainty. There's been discrimination on who gets help. There's been closures, and we're all trying to manage this in isolation, hence stress. And so mental health symptoms of trauma are very wide. It's a broad thing, but some of them would be hypervigilance, and that is when I say, you cough and you're like, oh my gosh, it's COVID, that's being hypervigilant. We're all very, very, very aware of what's going on in our bodies. So if we feel the slightest bit off, that's like a scary thing. Whereas back in, 2019, it would be like, oh, maybe I have the cold, or maybe I just slept with the window open. So we're all very hypervigilant of that. There's also oftentimes avoidance of things that scare us. So, for example, there are people who are still not going to the grocery store. That would be avoiding something that would be technically, I would say the majority of people are pretty comfortable with that. Obviously, you take safety precautions, but there are people who are too afraid to leave their house. That is avoiding situations. Depressed mood, that looks different for everybody. A lot of people will talk about, they'll come in and they're like, well, I'm not that sad, I just don't feel anything. Feel a lot like apathy. And so that still is considered depressed mood. There's negative thoughts. It's hard to just have that positive attitude, and I know that was something that we all tried to do at the beginning of this, was this is going to be self-discovery time, I'm going to just really invest in who I am and all of that stuff, and I was sitting there guys, we have to honor that this is hard. So negative thoughts spiral when we don't allow ourselves to feel our feelings, or if there's an anxiety disorder going on. Irritability is how I measure people's level of burnout. So if someone comes to me and is like, I just can't stop snapping at my husband, even though I love him, right? I'm like, well, maybe you're burnt out. Maybe you need some time to take care of yourself. So your irritability meter, I would say, indicates a lot of how you're doing mentally and emotionally. And then there's kind of this lack of purpose going on, and that is, if you think about America, a lot of our purpose and identity is really wrapped up in our careers. So when you have a pandemic wipe out a ton of the job market, where are we going to get our purpose from? Hence, lack of purpose. And then there's also, like I've mentioned, this underlying constant sense of stress. Even if you're not aware that you're thinking about COVID, I guarantee you if you made a tally of how many times you thought about COVID throughout the day, it would be in the hundreds. So it's just kind of a constant underlying thing. And then again, there's taps into the lack of purpose, but since there's really no light at the end of the tunnel, a lot of people, it's easy to be like, well, what's the point? And it just kind of leads into this hopelessness feeling. Physical symptoms, again, can be super broad. The way I think about this is basically if you've gone to the doctor, they've done every test in the book, and you still feel terrible, it's probably connected to your mental health. So for some people, it can be lethargy, it can be racing heart rate, heart palpitations, headaches, muscle tension, shaking spells, you name it. It can be really broad. And then spiritual health symptoms. I think when things are really hard, when we feel like Job, it brings about this problem of pain, the why would a good God allow this to happen questions. And not that those are bad to ask, but they can make it hard to continue pursuing the Lord and leaning into the Lord. And then on top of that, we lost our churches. Chapel Hill is really blessed to be open, but some churches still aren't able to be open, and our community just looks different. A lot of it is online, you lovely Facebook people, and some people truly can't go even when churches are open, and I totally get that. It makes it really hard to connect with people who share our values. Okay, and then you also I think we can all attest to when we get out of the habit of going to church or doing anything, really, it's hard to get back into it. And so there is also that sense of, oh, well, church is open now, but, I've gotten used to not going, or I've gotten used to doing it online, and so it's I really don't need it. And it's not until you get back and you're standing there worshiping with your fellow people that you're like, oh, this is actually really, really good. So this is how COVID is impacting us. So let's talk about your kids. The reason I would suspect most of you guys are here because parents are all about their kids, and often it's not actually about themselves, which is part of why I have a job. So, what changes have you guys noticed? And Facebook people, you can put these in the chat. What changes have you noticed in your kids since this started? Weight gain, yeah, we're going to talk about that. Yeah, lethargy, low energy. Yeah. Yes, it's familiar emotion for me too. What about you guys? Yeah. Just, yeah, high conflict. Yeah, which, yes. Okay. Anybody online?
No.
Okay,
not
cool.
yet. It's a little delayed though, so
Oh,
it might
well,
be coming.
Cool, just let me know. So, we're going to talk about all of these, but first I want to give you the tools for when you are noticing those changes. So I've broken this down into kind of 4 categories because our health is holistic, right? And I think we're getting a lot better at recognizing that. It's not just about our physical health. Our mental and physical health are super intertwined, and emotional, spiritual, and all that stuff. So, when it comes to mental health, how can you help your kids cope mentally? What I would say is use this time as a crash course in teaching them emotional expression. So what happens with kids when they don't understand what's going on, but they know that it's weird, something is off, and they don't like it, how are they going to handle those big emotions if they don't have the language or the tools to do so? Especially if you've got younger kiddos, that's a lot of what child play therapy is about, is getting them to be able to identify what's going on in those little minds and hearts and be able to express that. So what I mean by that is identifying emotions, being able to verbalize emotions, and then being able to cope with emotions. How do you do that, Lauren? Good question. It mostly comes through modeling. Kids watch you. I mean, sometimes they catch the things that you don't want, right? Like, I think every parent's had that experience of they said a bad word and the next day their 2-year-old's repeating it on the playground and it's horrifying. So same thing happens with emotions. So for example, you can talk about when you're having a hard time. I think there's this misconception that parents can sometimes have that they need to put on this like happy face for their kids and that things are fine. But if you do that, how are they going to learn that being sad is okay? Or how are they going to learn that they need to be able to express their anger and not stuff their anger, or that there is a healthy way to be angry? Even with conflict, they've found studies where, parents talk about, well, I don't like to fight in front of my kids, or I don't want them to see that, and so their kids never see their parents have conflict, but then they never see them reconcile. And so then they don't have any of those communication skills to have healthy conflict and then also have that forgiveness, reconciliation conversation. So again, that can look like, mom had a bad day, I'm feeling really sad, so I'm going to go call my best friend because I know that helps me feel better. So in that moment, right, you identified an emotion and then you're doing something about it and you're validating that it's okay that I had that emotion. There are games that we'll talk about with this that are really great. But the other thing is also when your kid talks to you about an emotion or talks to you about, a bad day or a happy day, validate those emotions. And I think that's hard when it's a unpleasant emotion to feel because you automatically want to put a Band-Aid on your kid and give them a hug and be like, yep, you're fine now, because you want them to be fine. But for example, when this COVID thing started, I had a kiddo come in, probably the day they found out that schools were going to be closed, and he came in with his dad, and he just wanted to talk about COVID, and his dad's response was, well, you're fine, like, your kids don't get COVID, like, you're going to be fine, mom and dad have got it covered, and he kind of moved on. So session moves on, and it's just me and my client, and I'm like, well, what do you want to talk about? You seem anxious, like, what's going on? And all he wanted to do was talk about COVID. He wasn't terrified he was going to get it. He was terrified his mom was going to get it. And so if we move on, right, if we try to just make our kids happy, we're teaching them that it's not okay for them to be sad, when really it is okay for them to be sad, and there are healthy ways to cope with being sad. So when your kid is having those bad moments, explore that with them. Talk about how hard it is to feel sad, or that it's normal to feel angry, and then what do we do with that anger, right? Let's talk about healthy ways to do that, and that type of thing. If it's a younger kiddo, you're going to really just want to focus on identifying emotions and giving them those I feel statements, which I know sounds so basic to us. Well, of course I feel sad, mad, angry, whatever, but they're still learning those things. So simple I feel statements can be really effective. We had a whole game on that for my clients. And then mindfulness. Have any of you guys heard of mindfulness stuff? A little bit? Cool. Okay. So if you have, you're probably like, how do I apply that to a kid? And if you haven't, I'm going to talk about it. So mindfulness is kind of taking over, in a good way, a lot of the therapy practices. It's becoming incorporated for good reason, because it's shown to have so many benefits. It's based on two different kind of core tenets. The first one is anxiety lives in the past and anxiety lives in the future. So, for example, I'm terrified that I just contaminated people at the grocery store. That's the past. Or I'm terrified that grandpa's going to get COVID. That's the future. If you are so focused on the present, and I mean like down to how your body feels in the chair that you are sitting in, anxiety can't live there. It doesn't live in the true present moment. So what mindfulness does is it tries to get us in touch with that present moment. The other tenet is that we notice how we feel, what we're thinking, without judgment. That sounds easy, right? It's not. So our minds are very quick to make a judgment on anything. So for example, if I were to say, I really like this woman's sweater, I've made a judgment because I said I like it. If I were to simply describe that woman is wearing a sweater, that is without judgment. So our brains automatically do this, and so when we're having a mindful moment, part of what we do is we practice simply noticing those thoughts, and it can literally be, I had the thought that I liked that person's sweater. But it's allowing those thoughts to be there. And so for a kid who's angry, if he's trying to do a mindfulness activity and is having a thought, like, man, I just really want to go punch my brother. Okay, a mindful reaction to that would not be judging, ooh, I shouldn't have had that thought. It would be, oh, I just had that thought. Interesting, I'm going to move on. So for like a mindful activity, there are some great apps out there that I do list. But they have guided mindfulness where you're walking this through with the kid. It's guiding them through it. And it's getting them in tune with the present moment and encouraging them to just let their thoughts flow and not judge those thoughts. A lot of people will enjoy tuning into their five senses. So, for example, you can really make a lot of things a mindfulness activity. So, coloring in a coloring book. If you're letting your thoughts just flow and not judge them, and you're mindfully choosing colors and designing a picture, that's mindfulness. If while you're washing dishes, you're taking note, oh my gosh, okay, the water is really warm, it feels really good on my hands were kind of cold, this plate feels really tough, it feels like I could drop it. Again, so you're really tuned in with the senses of your hands and what's going on there. You can do this with your kids. Another thing about mindfulness is that not only does it help when you are immediately anxious, so a lot of people, this is really great for adults too, which we'll talk a little bit more about there, but when you're feeling anxious or you're feeling kind of panicky coming on, doing mindfulness often brings that anxiety down. But it also helps, generally speaking. So if you make a habit of doing mindfulness, your the amount of times where your anxiety spikes also lowers. They've been starting to do this, some schools have, in place of detention, and the results have been fabulous because kids are getting in tune with the present moment, they're feeling less anxious, and then of course less conflict. And then play, I put here because, I feel like you can't do a parenting seminar without talking about the importance of play. This is where kids let their imaginations run. It's where they learn social skills, they reenact things, they're processing. A kid's language is play. And so it is really important to encourage that, and especially for people who have the kids who might be playing video games a little bit more than they want them to be. And you're like, well, how do I play with my kid? You play with your kid. There's actually a therapy practice called parent-child interaction therapy, and all it is doing is teaching parents how to play with their kids. Because kids thrive on that time. They thrive on that intentional, mom's choosing to play with me, mom's being imaginative with me, and it really, really builds that relationship. So encourage play however you can, which leads right into the screen time of physical aspects of health. So I'm not going to tell you to restrict your kid to 30 minutes of screen time a day. It's not going to work, especially when you're also trying to work a full-time job from home and all of that crazy stuff. What I will say is take note of how it is impacting your kid. If you're noticing, they don't ever want to spend time with you, and it's a little bit different for teens because teens naturally go through that, like, I'm an adult type thing, and they don't want to spend time with you, but they do, they just can't tell you. It's great. Anyway, for kids, if they're choosing to never spend time with you, or they're really irritated if their time is interrupted, part of that, identify, okay, is this because it's the only social interaction they're getting, right? Because you don't want to cut that off. Or it's because they've stared at a screen for 7 hours and they've forgotten how to be social. So just with that, note how it's impacting them emotionally. If you're noticing their irritability is going up, if you're noticing they don't want to be active or play or do other normal teen things, then you want to talk about, okay, why is that going on? So for a kid, if you're just like, we're now limiting TV to 2 hours a day, they're probably going to throw a temper tantrum, right? Which is okay, but I would encourage you to do the conversation route. Okay, so why are you watching so much TV? Like, what's going on? Is this where you feel socially connected? Is this a coping skill? Does it make your anxiety come down? Are you bored out of your mind? Like, let's talk about why. And then we'll address, okay, so maybe it is the social interaction thing. Let's talk about how we can fix that so that we can get you engaged with people again and not strip them from their coping mechanism, because that is when people's anxiety is going to flare up because you just took away the one thing that's making them feel better. Okay, and so we're going to talk about movement and intuitive eating, which will, I think, get at one of your guys' question, or a couple of you guys actually. So I'll talk about this a little bit more and give specific resources when we get to the adult one. But let's talk about why we all gained weight during COVID-19, shall we? It's because your body is protecting you. So back in the day, if there was a national crisis or a world crisis and your body was in charge of keeping you safe, it would be assuming that you're not going to have access to food, you're not going to have the same survival mechanisms that you would have had, and so it's going to hold on to every single calorie that it can because it is prepping for that food loss. So our bodies are naturally wired to protect us. Therefore, it's normal to have put on a couple pounds because your body is simply trying to protect you. For kids, it's the same thing. I would encourage, if your kid's kind of in that prepubescent or puberty age, a lot of times that's when oh my gosh, they're higher in the percentile than they were when they were, a year younger, and then we start freaking out. That's actually good. It's natural. They're getting ready for their growth spurt. But for pandemic reasons, back in the day, if a pandemic hit, our bodies would have been in famine. So the fact that your kid or us, whoever, has put on some weight thank your body for doing its job. Frustrating when you live in a society that is, terrified of gaining weight, but that's what's going on. So with that, you want to encourage intuitive movement and eating. What I mean by that is, for all of you guys who have had a baby, which is, I'm assuming all of you are you're taking care of a kid, think about a newborn. When they eat, they wail because they're hungry, they get fed, they stop eating when they're full, and then they go take a nap. And then they alert you again when they're hungry. We lose those hunger cues because we stop listening to them as we get older. So what we're finding is kids as early as kindergarten are already wanting to be on a diet, already are feeling better if they're hungry, so they like the feeling of being hungry because it makes them feel skinny. They're already disliking their bodies. Like, this is as young as 6 years old. And so because of that, we stop listening to our hunger cues. When we stop listening to our hunger cues, our body's like, okay, I'm not going to give them to you anymore because you don't listen. So then your body is in famine mode. So again, it's holding on to those calories, and then it's not giving you those I'm full or I'm hungry cues. Because of that, we don't know really when to eat, what to eat, when to stop eating. This is a big thing in America. They actually did a study where they measured the relationship between food and the person across different cultures. And one of the questions was, when do you stop eating at a meal? All of the Americans said, well, not all of them, but the majority said, when my plate's empty, right? Sounds normal. The French people said, when I'm full, that's when I stop eating. So in America, it starts so young, and we lose those hunger, fullness cues, and then it's really hard to get them back, and there's a lot of work into that. So the basics of intuitive eating is you listen to what your body wants, you fuel it the way it wants you to, and then you go about and you live your life. So that looks like eating when you're hungry, stopping when you're full, and also honoring cravings. So it's not like that there's like a hunger fullness diet going on. It's not that, because you also honor those cravings, because your body's craving it for a reason. And when you don't give your body those cravings, it craves it for like the rest of the day. It's kind of like when you wanted that cookie at noon, but you're like, oh no, wait, I'm not going to eat it. And then it's like 8 p.m. and you've eaten 5 cookies. Well, it's because you didn't honor that craving. So with your kids, again, this goes back to modeling, which is why I've got a whole, like a book resource for parents. Because if you think about it, as young as when you're starting to physically feed your kid, that's when these things can start. So for example, grandma comes over, she's feeding little Timmy, and Timmy's full. But grandma's, oh, just a couple more bites, Timmy, you can do it, just eat a couple more bites. That simple act started to get rid of the hunger fullness cues, because Timmy didn't want to eat it, not because it was green, but because he was full. So modeling for your kid, I'm hungry, so I'm going to eat. Or, you know what, mom is really craving that smoothie, so I'm going to go eat that smoothie. That type of thing. Same thing applies to sugary foods. Again, though, when you've been in famine, your body is going to hold on to all of those calories. So it takes a while for your body to be like, oh, we're not dying, we're not threatened. So oftentimes people will gain weight and then they come back down because their body stopped freaking out. For your kids, encourage, obviously nutrition is a big thing because we all have a certain amount of nutrients that we need, and we need those nutrients whether we're in a bigger body or a smaller body. So I would say focus on the nutrients, focus on allowing them to eat when they want to, but also start training that I'm full, so I'm going to stop eating even though I have the food still on my plate. Intuitive movement, same thing. Our bodies were made to move. Our bodies were also made to rest. When we're in a pandemic, again, our energy levels are going to drop because our bodies are literally trying to conserve energy. So that's normal that your kids are feeling lethargic. Also, movement again, at a young age, can be tied into punishment. And so think about, the basketball coach who makes them run lines whenever they miss a certain amount of free throws. It equates movement to punishment. So when I say intuitive, find movement that they love rather than what will feel forced. So if you have a kid who absolutely loves running around, that's fabulous. If you have a kid who absolutely despises running, don't make them run. Brainstorm, okay, well, maybe they love soccer, maybe they love basketball, maybe they love weight training, maybe they love scooters, biking, yoga, Pilates, anything like that. Playing outside is a great form of movement as is. So what I would encourage you guys to do when you have those kids who are like, I'm just going to sit in front of the TV all day, again, ask why. Why don't you want to move? Maybe they think their only option is going on a run or bike ride it or soccer, and they don't want to do that. Okay, well, that's fine. We don't have to do that. Let's go on a family walk instead. Does that make sense? I'm seeing some nods. Cool. Okay, cool. And then sleep routine. Sleep routine is not a magical cure, but it's really important when you especially have kids who are irritable and tired. Really important combo. When we sleep, our brain's neuroplasticity is literally like redoing itself up in there, and that's why we feel so much better after a good night's sleep. So when it comes to this, I think it's relatively difficult to have an exact bedtime and an exact wake-up time that is not going to vary very much. So what I would say is make a goal that is going to be relatively consistent. So by that I mean have a routine that will stay the same even if the time is changing. Obviously the ideal is getting the time to where it is pretty consistent, but if you can't do that, make the routine. So maybe Susie likes to take her showers at night and then have a nice glass of water and then brush her teeth, get in her pajamas, and then read a bedtime story. That would be the exact same thing every night. Or maybe Tommy doesn't like showering at night, he likes showering in the morning, so he brushes his teeth, plays with the dog a little bit, and then snuggles in and gets a head rub before bed. Again, make it consistent as best as you can. And another thing, if that's not working, is try to make their bed just for sleep. So when they're doing their homework in their bed or that type of thing, and I mean, I've always been a good sleeper. I'm really blessed with that. So I did my homework in my bed all the time. But for a lot of people, bed needs to just be equated with sleep time in order for their bodies and their brains to wind down once they get in bed. So if you have a kid who's having a hard time sleeping, you'll want to encourage them to do their homework elsewhere, to maybe not read as much in bed, maybe they read on the couch, that type of thing. Just so that it's like when their body gets in bed, it's like, oh, okay, this is my sleepy place, I'm going to go to sleep. Okay, relational, I would say is probably like the parent's greatest concern was their relationship with their kid. Especially when you get the angsty teen years and it's like, my kid hates me now and I don't know what to do about that. It can be really hard for parents. So while we're quarantining and spending a whole lot of time together, again, this is a great crash course in building a relationship with your kid or teen. The best way I would say to do that is across the board, be very, very intentional. And what I mean by that is if you've got a kid whose love language is, which I'll talk about in a second, is quality time, picking them up from school is not the same thing as picking them up from school and choosing to go get hot cocoa. You see the difference, right? So you don't really have a choice in picking them up from school. Yes, you could have a friend do it technically, but like that's just your norm. But when you made the choice of, hey, like, I really want to spend some time with you, let's go get some hot cocoa and talk about your day or talk about your upcoming birthday or whatever, you've chosen to spend time with them. What that does is it teaches them, oh my gosh, mom and dad think I'm just so cool. They really want to spend time with me. They love me. They're not going to tell you that, but that's what they're thinking. And then they get this inflated sense of self-esteem, and it's great. The piggybacking off of that is try to learn what your kid's love language is. Later slides have a website and an actual book for that, but it's the 5 love languages. And there's quality time, physical touch, words of affirmation, gifts, and acts of service. So if you have a kid who is all about words of affirmation, okay, cool. Maybe part of that is let's start writing them notes that go in their lunchbox every day, or really being intentional about how you compliment them. And when you compliment them, it's about their identity and who they are as a person. Maybe they're really into physical touch. Okay, let's start incorporating that at bedtime. Let's scratch their back before bed or do a head rub, that type of thing. Being intentional, again, about those things makes your kid feel, oh, I'm important. They care about me, and they're speaking to me in a way that I understand. If you've got a really young kid, it goes back to that play. You want to be involved in playtime with your kid as much as you can. And then encourage safe play dates. Goes back to that we're all isolated, including our kids, right? If your kid can't go to school, how hard is that? I mean, especially developmentally, that's again how they learn, that's how they process, that's how they cope, and that those things are getting cut off. So my suggestions here are have your kid choose like 1 or 2 friends who you feel comfortable with the parents, you know the family, and you decide to be, if you are comfortable, to have them have play dates together. So that way it's kind of like a little quarantine pod. Like you know the family, you know what they're involved in. They'll tell you if they were out at a concert, whatever. And then you wouldn't have that play date. But that way it's kind of like your kid has this survival line of like, okay, I can play with somebody outside of school. It's harder because we're getting into the winter and fall months where it's harder to play outside. But when you can do those things, encourage those things if you're comfortable. Obviously, if you have somebody who's immunocompromised, I get that, in which case, help them plan the Zoom things, right? You can do fun activities over Zoom, over whatever your video thing is, but just let them know that's an option so that they don't feel like, I can't go to school, I'm screwed, I'm not going to see my friends ever again. And then spiritual. Again, I think this all just kind of goes back to this modeling piece. I think of that, raise your child up in the way they should go and they won't depart from it, because they're learning from you and they're valuing what you value. So incorporating family prayer, fabulous. Family dinner time, there's so much research linked to that, the benefits of that. Coming together as a family, which when you're all stuck in the same house, I mean, you're all there, no one's at soccer practice, so you guys can do it. But on top of that is, okay, like, let's say that little Timmy had a really bad day. Okay, well, instead of, just processing about it, let's pray about it. Or someone has a big test coming up and they're stressed about it, let's pray about it. So it's kind of just that modeling that prayer is just part of our everyday lives. There's a lot of great children's devotions and Bible storybooks out there. I remember I had some great storybooks as a kid that were Christian. And I think sometimes that can get forgotten as a good resource. And then, of course, if you're feeling really gung-ho about this, you can do family Bible verses. Make it a challenge, who can memorize the most, and you get some sort of prize, mommy-daughter date, that type of thing. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so these are some of the resources that I've alluded to. So Headspace is the most common mindfulness app. It, again, is great for adults, but also kids can really benefit from it. It will walk it through it, and it does it in a way that's inviting to kids. And they have free options and paid options, so you don't have to pay to get access to everything, which is great. The You Are Special book, I had to put this here because I actually watched the mini storybook here at Chapel Hill. I think it was a Sunday school thing. And I still vividly remember that video. I loved it. I felt amazing. And this book is just glorious. It teaches, basically the book plot line is that people are giving out demerits and you wear them all over your shirt. And you get a gold star and stuff if you're like a cool person. And then he meets the creator of all of these creatures. And the creator is like, oh my gosh, no, that's not how this is intended to be. So it's really beautiful. It teaches a lot about values and what we should value about ourselves and other people. It's brilliant. What happens when my brain gets stuck? I'd be remiss if I didn't give an OCD resource, because I'm an OCD therapist for kids. But this is also good for kids who are anxious. And so I think we can all kind of, whether or not you have this disorder, relate to when you're really anxious about something. It just kind of keeps replaying in your brain. This is a great book for kids that walks through why that happens and what to do about it. Breathe Like a Bear is a book that is a mindfulness book, and it's teaching your kids to breathe deeply, breathe mindfully, and that's like focusing on your breath and that type of thing, but you're doing it like a bear, so it's cool. The ones on the bottom corner are all fidget toys. And fidget toys got such a bad rap because of those annoying fidget spinners came out. I don't know if you guys remember that. Parents, teachers hated them for a good reason. But fidget toys are actually really beneficial, and it's one of those things that you don't know you need until you have them, and then you love that you have them. There are some really cheap sets that you can get online, just going on Amazon. And all it is they're playing with these things while they're trying to focus on something else. It relaxes people, it helps them focus more. So like, for example, my sweet neighbor girl has a set that she plays with during class, and it helps her relax and it helps her stay focused. So as much as they have a bad rap, they're really amazing. Just try them out. Totika is for, I would say, kids 11 and up. And they come in different themes, so there can be like a self-esteem one, there can be a divorce one. And what it is it's just like Jenga, but it's color coordinated. So if you pull out an orange block, then you read the orange question on the cards, and they're just open-ended questions. It's really good at sparking good conversation and processing things. The mindfulness coloring book is for the older kids who aren't going to be content just coloring a choo-choo train. So it can also be great for adults who like to color. The Candyland, you're probably like, why is that on there? Feelings Candyland, I guarantee you if you ask any therapist about Feelings Candyland, they have played it before. All it is regular Candyland, and you pick emotions that will correlate to the colors that you land on, right? So there's like yellow, orange, red, purple, whatever. So at the beginning of the game, you establish, okay, everyone always chooses happy for yellow. So happy will be yellow, and whenever you land on that yellow square, you talk about a time that you were really, really happy, or you talk about things that make you really happy. So, if I were to land on yellow, I'd talk about my dog or something like that. But the same thing happens with, the sad, mad, those types of things. And it, again, gets them comfortable with just talking about emotions and identifying emotions. Angry Animals is a great thing for kids who have a hard time processing their anger. It involves animals, so therefore it's cool. And it walks you through healthy ways of processing anger, so like different coping skills, different ways you can do that, and is a really good option for kids who kind of have that explosive thing. And when they're exploding, it's just because they don't know how to tell you what's going on. They don't know how to process what's going on, so they explode. Great game for that. The Stop, Relax, Think is specific to ADHD, but has some really great relaxing coping skills on the cards. But my favorite therapy game is Dr. Playwell's Worry Less game. It has by far the best coping skill things that I've ever seen in a game. And you're conquering anxiety monsters as you work your way across the board. And it's got different themes, so there'll be a card deck on like relaxation techniques, there'll be a card deck on relationship things, and it's a really good option. The therapy games, unfortunately, can get a little spendy, so if you're going to get one, again, get the Worry Less one. The Wheel of Coping that was like the first craft I ever did with a client, so it's near and dear to my heart. But basically, you can make any craft into a coping skills craft. All it does is involves, let's talk about coping skills. So for this one specifically, you get 2 paper plates. On the bottom one, Brainstorm with your kid different things that make them feel better, that make them feel like they can process their emotions. And then you write them in little pie kind of shapes. And then you put the top one on it, you let them color it, you cut out a little piece of the pie, and then whenever they're having a hard time, they can look at their coping wheel, they can spin it and choose whichever coping skill it lands on. That's what I'm going to do. So you're probably like, what coping skills, what other like specific things would I write on that? And so that's my next question. I don't know, maybe this died. Oh, fabulous. Okay, so what would be on your personal wheel of coping, and what would you want to put on your child's one? Think about that for a second, and then I will rattle off my list, which can be pretty extensive. But right off the bat, what do you guys think? Anybody in the audience or on Facebook have any, like, this is my go-to coping skill for myself or my kid? Either one, what are you thinking? Like an activity? Yeah, something physical. That's great. Okay, so what is often on the wheel of coping in the therapy office is do 10 jumping jacks. Clench your fists, be like the Hulk is what we say. We're usually thinking of things that they could do during school because that's often when kids have the hardest time. So again, like clench your fists, you're being like the Hulk, and that relaxes muscles. Take 5 deep breaths and do it, put your hand on your belly while you do it, so you're feeling your body moving with your breath. Talk to an adult, which is important, but often forgotten for our little kids. Play with a friend, doodle, go for a walk, ride your bike, anything that you can think of for your kid that is going to just bring them down, that can go on that type of wheel of coping. It's important to take into account what's going to work for them. So I've had kids who just don't like the muscle tensing thing. It makes them feel weird. But I have other kids who are like, yeah, I'm the Hulk, this is awesome. So again, you're going to just want to have a conversation with them of like, what makes you feel better? It might take them a little bit to get there, but they'll get there. They always do. You might need to fill in the blanks. I usually always was the one that added the talk to an adult because they always forget that one. But those are some ideas. Okay, now let's talk about you guys. So obviously you guys, my guests are all here because of your kids, which is fabulous. But can't pour from an empty cup, and so what I usually do when I have parent clients come in is I don't really pay a lot of attention to what they're doing as a parent because they're probably an overachiever. We talk about what they're doing for themselves first. So what are some self-care activities that you've been dreaming of? Just like, man, I wish I was on a beach in Maui drinking a smoothie, or let's see, some other ones. Like, I just want to be quiet. Like, I just want to be in a hotel room by myself. No one's yelling at me, touching me, nothing like that, right? Other people just really want to drive. They want to drive for hours. So we're going to figure out ways that you guys can do those things. Okay, so mental coping skills. Again, mindfulness is fabulous. It is easier to conceptualize as an adult because you're doing it yourself. You're not having to like train your kid, and you're not like learning it as much. But for mindfulness, I just encourage you to try to incorporate that into your everyday life. What I mean by that is being in tune with what's going on in the present, and when your mind is constantly pulling you forward or backward, it's like, nope, I'm dropping my kid off at school, and I'm going to focus on saying goodbye to them. So it's pulling them back into the present moment. Other ways of doing that with your 5 senses is you can like pick a color and count, all of the things that you can see in that color, that is really good for when you are feeling really quite antsy or panicky. Another thing is all just taking into account the 5 senses. So what are 5 things I can hear, 4 things I can see, 3 things I'm touching. Oftentimes we're not tasting anything unless you have gum, but that type of thing. Another thing that I forgot to mention that's a fun activity that for adults and kids, and it's a really good way of teaching what mindfulness is you get a piece of candy, which automatically your kid's like, ooh, candy, so they're focused. And so you set it in front of them, like at the dinner table or wherever, and you spend like a minute, and you're all just in tune with what does this piece of candy look like. I don't know if you guys have ever really like looked at a gummy worm, but like there's actually a lot to it. So you do that for a minute, and then you talk about it. Okay, what did you notice? What did you notice? You're going to notice different things, which is part of the uniqueness of being human, which is fabulous. And then once you talk about it, okay, let's touch it. So you're going to hold it in your hand for a minute and feel the different textures. Is it cold? Is it warm? Is it slimy? Is it sticky? And you're going to evaluate that and then talk about it afterward. And then you're going to taste it. And you're going to do that mindfully, which is another way to do intuitive eating, is when you're eating really mindfully. You're in tune with what's going on in your body. And so then you talk about that with your kid. So for you guys as an adult, there's also great apps. I would say it's easier to find apps that will work for you because mindfulness was created originally for adults. Emotional validation is important for you guys too. If you're anything like me, if I wake up and I'm in a bad mood, usually I get mad at myself for being in a bad mood. What does that do to my mood? It just makes it worse. So for some reason, though, that's what we usually tend to do. So when we validate our emotions, we're like, okay, I'm feeling sad. It's okay that I'm feeling sad. I'm going to let myself feel sad, but I'm also going to tap into some of my coping skills. Like I know it's going to help me if I go for a walk or play with the dog or call a friend or that type of thing. But first, you have to validate that emotion. If we don't, that's when our brain's constantly stuck on it, keeps bringing it up, and then we're just constantly feeling icky because we're not allowing ourselves to feel icky. It's just a cycle that we get caught into. So validate your own emotions, and in doing so, you're going to encourage your kids to do that as well. Try your hardest to create space for yourself. That's going to look a whole lot different than it might have in the past. If you have a partner, you're going to want to talk about how can we make this happen for each of us. So I have one couple where she knows if he's getting on edge that he needs to take a drive. And so they have that deal, they've discussed it, and he'll go take a drive and come back, and then if she needs a break, then she gets to, go in her bedroom and watch TV. But have that conversation with your partner prior to implementing these things. But hide yourself in the bathroom, take a long shower, actually lock the door. I'm working so hard on one of my clients to lock the door so that her kids cannot keep coming in. Make that space. You can go for a drive, you can go for a walk, you can, again, lock yourself in the bathroom, in your bedroom, whatever. Even if it's 5 minutes, it will make a difference because that's 5 minutes to yourself to just breathe. Things are fine. I'm an adult. I have an identity outside of being a parent, and I need to honor that too. And then, of course, therapy. Therapy is fabulous. I think everybody should do it. As a therapist, I'm kind of supposed to say that, but it's true. Having a space where you're truly just talking to somebody about yourself. They're not talking about themselves at all. They're 100% there for you is an amazing feeling. So I highly encourage it in general for anybody, whether or not you're experiencing trauma, but we all are, so go to therapy. Intuitive movement, like I said, in intuitive eating, similar concepts as that you're modeling to your kids. It's eating when you're actually hungry, whether or not you feel like you should be. If you're hungry, you're hungry. And if you're getting out of the famine phase of putting your body in starvation mode, you might have heard of that, but your body's going to be extra hungry because to it, you haven't been eating normally for the past however long. So honor those hunger cues, feed your body when it's hungry, stop when you're full, allow yourself to have those cravings, and do your best to not get mad at yourself along the way. Same thing for intuitive movement. Find things that you enjoy to do that don't feel like a punishment. It's going to look different for everybody, and that's 100% okay. Sleep routine, same thing as your kids. It's just as important for us. It never ceases to amaze me how one really bad thing could happen the day before I get a good night's sleep, and the next day I'm like, oh, that's not that bad. Like, we can handle that. So honor that as much as you can. And again, if you can't go to bed at the same time, at least try to have a similar routine. If you're really, really struggling to sleep, that is the time to get into your doctor's office to figure out how to help you sleep, because when lack of sleep is worse for driving than drunk driving. It impacts us so significantly. Relationally, I know some people won't want to hear this, but this is also a crash course in how to invest in your marriage. I know so many people, when we were like in lockdown, were just like, I'm sick of this person, I love them, but I'm sick of them, and I feel bad about it. That's okay, that's normal. They're the only person you're seeing in physical presence usually, so no wonder you're going to get at each other's throats a little bit. But it can also be a really great time to tap into just really like growing your relationship. It's one thing to work on your relationship when things are good. It's another thing to work on your relationship when things are really hard, because you're having to tap into those tools even more because things are hard. So then when things are good, it's like, oh, this just feels way easier than it did. So some ways to do that, I would say the number one thing is to figure out each other's love languages and then do those things for each other. I do this with literally every single client I've ever had. So you take the quiz online at the 5lovelanguages.com. It's free. Take the quiz together. A lot of couples will be really surprised at the answers that they each give. So it'll give a scenario, and then it's like what makes you feel more loved, and then there's like a physical touch option, or like a words of affirmation option, and you click it until you get to the end and get your list, your rank. And then once you each have your top love languages, what you do is you write down specific things that will make you that will feed into that type of love tank. So for example, if you're a words of affirmation person, sending me a text on your lunch break, or writing me a note that tells me why you love me, or that type of thing. So you're writing those specific things down, you make a list of it, you tear those little things up so that you can read them, but separate them out, put them in a jar, hat, whatever, and then you pick one out every single night. It just kind of becomes part of your routine. And then you either do that activity at that moment, or you plan to do it the next day, that type of thing. So it just kind of becomes ingrained in you, like, okay, I'm going to give my partner the love that they need. We tend to give the type of love that we want. So for example, I am a words of affirmation person, and I need to remember my husband is not. And that can be really hard. So this is a great way to practice just getting into that routine. Invest in your families and friendships, which is hard, but just as important as it's ever been. And I think it's easier though now to be like, I'm just not going to schedule something online because it's just not the same. And you're right, it's not the same. Doing a Zoom call with your best friends is not the same, but it's something. And right now we all need something. So the more you can do that, the better. Call those long distance family members and all those types of things. And then respect whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert. The way you think about that is, where do I get my energy from? Maybe you really love people, but by the end of the day, you're really exhausted when you've been working with people all day, so then you're probably an introvert. Your self-care is going to be more quiet time by yourself, going on the walk by yourself. If you're an extrovert, you're going to feel really, really tired after sitting at a computer all day and not having any social interaction. So then you need to honor that, and you're going to want to schedule a phone call or go for a walk with a friend, that type of thing. Talk about this with your partners too, because they need to be aware of a lot of partners who are introverted feel guilty for taking time by themselves because they worry that their partners are going to take it personally, right? Because if you think about it, if their partner's not an introvert, it's like, oh, why don't they want to hang out with me? So having those conversations are really important to know it's literally just your personality type, but it really is important. And then spiritual time, quiet time, I think of Jesus, like he spent quiet time when it was like the hardest times. Like even when crowds of people were wanting his attention, he would walk away and spend time with God. It's really hard to do, but I think that's why we have the model of like there were literally crowds of people wanting his attention and he still did it. It's really important. Hard to do, but really important. Connect with the church family as much as you can. If you can't go to church in person, that is okay. There are online small groups. There are online services. You can participate in the chat on the side of it. Just try your best to get involved with the body of Christ. And then, of course, I think such a simple one that we sometimes forget is worship music, and that can be a great thing to just do in the car. I remember growing up, we always listened to worship music in the car, and it was just kind of my norm, and it still kind of is. So that's a great way to incorporate it as well. So these are the specific resources I've mentioned. So for an app, it's called the Gottman Card Deck app, and Gottman is this researcher. He's actually out of UW, but this card deck app is great for when you just want to kind of connect with your partner in a way that maybe you haven't in a while. So it breaks these decks down into themes. So there's intimacy, there's your likes and dislikes, there's lots of things like that, and they just spark open-ended conversations. So you kind of feel like you did when you were dating. I've yet to have a couple not enjoy this. They really are quite fun. Then Headspace, Calm, and My Life are great mindfulness apps for adults. And I don't know if Calm has a kid version. They might. I know the other two do. But those are great for mindfulness. The websites, there's the 5 love languages. For my fellow introverts out there, Introvert Dear has a lot of great resources just on what it's like to live as an introvert in a society that values extroverts more right now, and it also has great articles on like couples life, like what it's like to be a partner if you're of an extrovert or a fellow introvert, that type of thing. Books, so Health at Every Size is the one that's going to be about intuitive eating and intuitive movement. It's fabulous. It is quite easy to read, but it's like it'll blow your mind. Why We Sleep will scare you out of your mind and make you sleep a lot more because it talks about how much sleep is important to our everyday lives. A Grace Disguised is my favorite grief book. He was actually one of my professors at Whitworth, and he went through a lot of loss, really traumatic loss, and wrote this beautiful book. I recommend it probably at least once a week. And it's really good for if you've experienced death and that type of thing, but it's also good to think about we grieve things outside of death. We grieve loss of jobs, we grieve divorce, we grieve death, all of those things, and so it is really a great resource. Quiet is for my fellow introverts. The Body Keeps the Score is a popular trauma book, and it talks about the relationship between trauma and the body. And then, of course, the 5 love languages, he does have a book. There's like a couples version that you can walk through together. Okay, so let's talk about the most important things, in my opinion, is like warning signs. So when is this not just I had a bad day or that type of thing? When are the coping skills not going to work? When do we need extra help? If you get 3 things out of this seminar, remember the top predictors of suicide are isolation, feeling like a burden, and lack of hope. So if you're seeing one of these things, that's kind of a warning sign to check in. If you're seeing 2, that means you need to get an appointment with a doctor, a counselor, that type of thing. If you're seeing 3, further evaluation, it might even be like call a crisis line, that type of thing. So first and foremost, if you I don't know if any of you would have heard of the ACEs study. It was kind of this big research study that was published, I think, like 10 years ago, somewhere in there. And what it did was it looked at the life experiences impact on kids' health in the future. And so some ACEs would be having an abusive parent, having a severely mentally ill parent, divorce, I think race is in there, that type of thing. And so if your kid has an ACE score, I think it's even like 2 or above, it's highly connected to negative health outcomes as an adult. So if you know for a fact your kid falls into some of those categories, and truly you could just Google the ACEs research and it'll be there, that is kind of when you just want to do some looking for a counselor, that type of thing, almost like as a precautionary thing, just because you know they fall into that category. Okay, so then saying goodbyes, I don't mean like saying goodbye on the telephone, but there's something different about kind of more of that pointed, I'm really completing this relationship type of goodbye, or if they're wanting to reach out to other people and say goodbye, that's a warning sign. Talking about what is the point is hard when you've got a teen, because they're like, what's the point of doing this school assignment, that type of thing. But it's a deeper thing of like, why am I here? I don't feel purpose, that type of thing. That's a warning sign. Chosen isolation, again, harder when you have a teen, but because they like the isolation thing, but it's this chosen thing. They're cutting themselves off from people in general, even their friends, even their teachers, even their family members, siblings, people that they've liked, hanging out with, spending time with, they're cutting themselves off. Warning sign. Probably one of the biggest warning signs, I would say. Violent artwork, I didn't buy into this until I saw an example of it, but there are certain prompts that we'll give kids to draw pictures of, and it becomes really obvious sometimes who's having a really hard time at home. I'm not saying go have your kid draw artwork and try to evaluate it, because that's not your job. But if you're noticing a pattern or a theme of like some pretty dark themes or sad themes, that type of thing, you're going to want to check in. Referring to yourself as a burden, kind of think of Eeyore a little bit. That's where we want to check in on self-esteem, but also if it's in tandem with other things, that's when we want to book a counseling appointment. And then the bottom 3 are, like, I would say, like the scariest things for parents. So if there's, of course, the self-harming, if you're finding that out, you definitely want to get them into a doctor or a counselor. I would say usually this is a self-soothing mechanism, which I know sounds crazy if you haven't ever experienced it. But what is usually going on is 2 things. Either they're not feeling anything, they're feeling extremely apathetic, they're not connected to their emotions, and they just need to feel something. And so they self-harm to feel something. Or the opposite is going on, where they have so much in their brain, they don't know what to do with it, and they need to focus on one thing, so they focus on the sensation in their arm. That's not to say this is not a big deal. You do want to, of course, get an appointment right away if you find out about this. But usually it is a self-soothing thing, and the counselor is going to be able to give them the tools to cope. And then risky behavior, substance abuse, I'm talking like drunk driving, using drugs, underage, that type of thing. Check in on the why. I think that's another really important thing, is like, what's going on? Why is this happening? Is this because your friends are doing it, or is this because you're so depressed you don't know what to do? Okay. So then, I once had a client ask me, so what is healthy? And I was like, that's an amazing question. For a healthy person, you're going to experience all of the emotions in the world. This was just simply pulled off of Google, but you can find emotion wheels everywhere. But it's going to be a variety of emotions that you experience during any given day. It's pretty scattered around the wheel. Of course, we all have our bad days, that type of thing. We're also in a pandemic, so it's going to be a little bit skewed. But generally speaking, you're experiencing a wide variety. When you have an anxiety disorder, depression, anything else, you're going to live in just one of those sections. So, or not just one, but the negative, quote unquote, sections. So the like fear, sadness, and anger sections, you're going to basically be living there. You're not going to have a lot of the joy, the surprise, the other ones that your average Joe would be feeling. And so, again, it's been a hard time. So it's understandable if we're a little bit skewed toward the sadder, madder, angrier emotions. But what we're striving for is that beautiful array of color. Okay, so now what? Crisis lines are in the bottom. I just suggest having those in your kids' phones. You never know, but oftentimes what I see is I have a kid or a teen talking to me about their suicidal friend. So kids often won't tell the adult, they'll tell their friend they're having a hard time. And kids are then asked to handle an adult issue. So having a crisis line in their phone, they immediately know who to call, that type of thing, and then it takes it off of their shoulders. Kind of just talk through what happens if they are in crisis. But conceptualize a realistic self-care routine for yourself and your family. So I encourage you guys to talk to your partners, evaluate for yourself, and then also include your kids in that conversation. Talk about how they're doing. See how they're feeling about the fact that we're 8 months into a pandemic. And then conceptualize, okay, what's going to be realistic? By that I mean what is going to be achievable, what feels manageable. Oftentimes people will just like dive in headfirst into self-care, which is fabulous, but then the self-care starts stressing them out because they're not doing the stress care anymore, which is so great. So make sure it's realistic, something that you feel like will actually be helpful and that you can sustain. Evaluate, like I said, of your own health, evaluate your family's health. By that I mean, like have those conversations, just get that ball rolling. Oftentimes kids are like, oh, it's okay to talk about when I'm not happy, right? Or it's okay that I can be sad. Oftentimes they'll present anger and really it is this like sad hurt thing going on. And then these are the counseling resources. Again, if on those warning signs, if there are like 2, I would say that's when you want to get a counseling appointment. The best resources for that, there's a lot of therapy like search engines. The main one right now is Psychology Today, but there's plenty on, you just look up a counseling directory, that type of thing on Google. And there's a big old list. It's awesome if you can get referrals just so that you know the therapist, but that is a great place to start. I would also say if after 3 sessions your kid or yourself is not feeling super connected to the therapist, it is 110% okay to end therapy with that therapist and look for somebody else. That is your right, and you're going to make so much more progress if you and your therapist really connect. For if financial difficulties are a thing for you and your family, community mental health, group therapy, university counseling centers, and using an HSA account are great options. And you'll want to also just look into what your insurance covers. Oftentimes they will have listings of places that are in network with them so that they would cover some of the therapy stuff. Okay. We did it. You did it. Good job. Do you guys have any questions for me? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He's angry. Yeah. Yes. So I'm technically not supposed to answer specific questions, so I'm going to talk generally speaking for kids who are angry because of therapists, the ethics things. So for those situations, I would say have the conversations around coping skills when they're not angry. Once a kid is angry, once an adult is angry, their brain is flooded with hormones and nothing's getting through there. So it's really important to practice and like kind of create like a safety plan of sorts, like an actual plan, what happens when I'm starting to feel this way. That's why I go back to like learning how to identify emotions is so important, because it takes work for them to notice, I think I'm starting to feel angry, right? That's like the first step, is getting them to just notice, are you feeling angry right now? That is something that you can kind of get through when they are angry and their brain is already flooded. Even just identifying for them, like, I think you're feeling angry, is that accurate? And that starts getting them in touch with, okay, when my body starts feeling kind of tingly and red, my face is getting red, that means I'm angry. This is what I need to do. So I would say the first step, identify. And then then that's when you want to practice the coping skills when they're not angry yet. If they have a good morning when they're not flooded or stressed, and mornings are really hard for most families, that's super normal. Then even if they're not angry, still practice that coping skill, right? So, okay, if I was feeling really angry right now, I would do my 10 jumping jacks, or I would hold my breath, or something like that. So that, again, they're practicing it even when they're not immediately angry. Does that make sense? Cool. Anyone else? Cool. Oh, yes. So I think that goes back to that, validate yourself, because you are doing the impossible. There's just no way around it right now. And so, again, there is such a thing called the good enough parent, and that's what everyone ought to be striving for, but we also are all striving for this perfection parent. What I would say for that is focus on being consistent with your kid. They find a lot of research on how it's actually significantly worse for your kid if you're one day like really in touch with them and loving on them, and the next day you're super distant, than if you're continually distant. So if you are feeling just horrible guilt, overwhelmed, validate that that's normal, because you are trying to do the impossible. Validate that this is impossible. I'm not going to do this perfectly every day. Validate that that's okay. You're modeling to your kids, I'm having a hard time. It's okay for you to have a hard time too. And then remind yourself, work on just being consistent as best you can with the love that you give your kid. That's what's going to matter in the long run. Yeah. If you have specific questions or are interested in actual like counseling services or looking for referrals, this is my email, Lauren@cornerstoneocd.com if you're on Facebook. And I'm more than happy to connect you with people if it's out of my population that I'm seeing, or I can get you in touch or in services with me too. And then we're just going to end with this beautiful blessing that I think you have pulled up. I love this because it makes us feel connected to the world. The song is The Blessing, and I think we could all use a little bit of a reminder that parents are not in this alone, our kids are not in this alone. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. We just don't know when that is, but it is there. But I just adore this, so I hope you do too.
keep you, make his face shine upon you, and be gracious to you. Lord, turn his face toward you and give you peace. The Lord bless you and keep you,
make his face shine upon you,
and be gracious to you.
The Lord turn his face toward you
And give you peace.
The Lord bless you
And keep you, make his face shine upon you,
and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you,
and give you peace.
We pray a blessing, manna rain down from heaven. This isn't second guessing, we know that we are protected. May the peace that surpasses all understanding be our message. Grace and favors in your nature, in your
may
essence.
his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations,
And your family, and your children,
and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his presence go before you, and behind you, and beside you, all around you, and within you. He is with you, he is with you in the morning, in
That is my prayer for you guys. Know that you guys can do this. You're not alone. The church is still with you, and your kids are going to be blessed. So thanks for coming.
Let's give her some thanks here. Yeah. I mean, that video actually kind of sums it up really well in that this, even just taking this idea of mindfulness, if you can help your kids to be mindful that there is an ever-present God that's right there, right now in their life. He's dealt with the past. He's going to deal with the future, but this mindfulness of God in their lives is big. And for you to model that is going to give them that anchor that they need, and that's what we teach here. And as she was talking about the spiritual part, we have in person for the kids, K through 5th in this room, and they sit on these spots according to their age, and we teach this lesson here, but you can also do that from home. We provide all the lessons, we videotape them, put them on YouTube, and if you go back to the feed here, you'll see all the links to teach your kids from home. All these spiritual lessons for this, and so it's nice to see this. This just means integrity. For this month of October, we've been doing integrity, and next month it's going to be grateful. Teaching kids to be grateful, to be thankful in that Thanksgiving month. So just make sure you do that. Also, email me either at home there or you. If you want all of these slides, if you want them, just email me. It's phargreaves@chapelhillpc.org, and I will send you those. Or Lauren, if you got hers. And so thanks for coming. Let me close in prayer, if I could. Jesus, you are here, and you are there. You're there in these homes that are represented here. And we pray that that we would be very mindful of you and very mindful of your presence in our lives and the difference that can make in our lives. So whatever emotions we're feeling, whatever is happening relationally and physically, all those things, to know that we can center our lives on and find hope. We can find healing. We can find wellness. And I pray a blessing upon this group, whether at home or here in person. Just your peace would be overshadowing anything that feels hurtful or hard. And it's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right. Thanks for coming. Let me close in prayer, if I could. Jesus, you are here, and you are there. You're there in these homes that are represented here. And we pray that that we would be very mindful of you and very mindful of your presence in our lives and the difference that can make in our lives. So whatever emotions we're feeling, whatever is happening relationally and physically, all those things, to know that we can center our lives on and find hope. We can find healing. We can find wellness. And I pray a blessing upon this group, whether at home or here in person. Just your peace would be overshadowing anything that feels hurtful or hard. And it's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right. Thanks for coming. Let me close in prayer, if I could. Jesus, you are here, and you are there. You're there in these homes that are represented here. And we pray that we would be very mindful of you and very mindful of your presence in our lives and the difference that can make in our lives. So whatever emotions we're feeling, whatever is happening relationally and physically, all those things, to know that we can center our lives on and find hope. We can find healing. We can find wellness. And I pray a blessing upon this group, whether at home or here in person. Just your peace would be overshadowing anything that feels hurtful or hard. And it's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right. Thanks for coming.